For more on this spill, we're joined now in studio by Marissa Knodel. She's with Friends of the Earth. Marissa, Marina mentioned in her report, and also we know thousands of sea turtles, dolphins, and birds, fish were all affected by this spill. Can you just give us a really clear picture of how wide that impact was on wildlife?
Well, it's been 6 years since the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster, and it was one of the worst oil disasters in U.S. history. And unfortunately, the Gulf Coast continues to see some really devastating impacts from however you look at it. In terms of wildlife, like you reported, numbers of dolphins are having stillborn births. The oyster and fishing industries, some are reporting losses of down by a third still 6 years later. And you're also seeing loss of tourism dollars from the inability to go out. And also the oil, like you said, a lot of it is still unaccounted for, and they think that might still be somewhere down in the Gulf of Mexico.
From what I understand, pieces of tar still wash up on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. And can you talk also about Corexit, the spray that BP used to counter the oil in the water? Didn't that also end up doing some damage to the environment there?
A number of studies have come out very critical of the oil dispersants like Corexit that were used to dissipate the oil. I believe it was about 1 million gallons or so of oil dispersants were used. And some of those, a lot of scientists think, also are contributing to a lot of the significant wildlife impacts.
Do you think any lessons were learned in terms of what can go wrong by allowing this type of drilling to happen right off the shores of this country? I mean, the Obama administration, the federal government, still approves offshore drilling, and it's seen as a solution by some members of government to energy problems. But I mean, it seems as though they've forgotten the impact that it can have when these types of accidents happen.
You're absolutely right. The most important lesson that the federal government should have learned from Deepwater Horizon is that there's no such thing as safe offshore drilling. And yet, unfortunately, the only thing that has recovered in the 6 years since the oil disaster is the oil and gas industry in and of itself. I mean, even despite low oil prices, the production from the Gulf of Mexico is expected to hit record levels in 2017. And I think the most disturbing thing is that the federal government still continues to recklessly ignore that lesson and continue to offer new leases in the Gulf of Mexico. We're coming up here at the end of the 2012 to 2017 5-year offshore drilling program. And on March 15th, the new 27 to 2022 draft program was released by the federal government, and it includes 10 new leases in the Gulf of Mexico.
Fascinating. I understand the state government announced that it's getting about $1.5 billion in settlement money from BP for this spill. It's unclear how much of that will trickle down to the devastated fishing industry that you talked about. So what are people in these communities doing to organize, and what's next for activists there that are seeking compensation and also accountability still 6 years on?
I think accountability is a really big thing. One thing that you are seeing with Gulf Coast communities right now, which has really been unprecedented, driven in part by the BP Deepwater Horizon, in part by Hurricane Katrina, and in part by this continuation of offering new leases in the Gulf of Mexico. What you're seeing is communities rising up and saying, no longer can you or should you treat the Gulf of Mexico like an energy sacrifice zone. And on March 23rd, there was an oil and gas lease sale for 45 million acres, and you saw that was held in the Superdome, and you saw hundreds of people turn out to oppose that. And you also saw this week dozens of residents turn out in Houston and in New Orleans to oppose the new lease sales being offered in the draft 5-year plan. And they're just going to continue to be out there on the street and make their voices heard.
Interesting that the communities seem to have learned the lessons and now want to oppose drilling, but the federal government doesn't seem to want to do the same. Marissa Knodel, Friends of the Earth, thank you so much for adding your perspective to this.
Thank you for having me.